note also our discussion to follow. I said to Madame Lagarde, I said 2 hours or 3 hours, and that was vetoed. But we'll have a very good conversation about so many topics today. Drift. She did not drift doing synchronized swimming at a level that none of us will ever attend. She did not drift when I first met her within the ministries of commerce and industry, and particularly agriculture for her France. She did not drift in finance, creating original territory, I might say there. She has been on the watch here now for 7 years, and as all of you know and live every day, here at this International Monetary Fund, she does not drift. 2015, Jakarta. The global community needs its fourth largest and most youthful population, which goes to the heart of the matter, the original idea of the importance of Indonesia, and in these times, these challenging times, this idea of drift. I should note that she has just accepted the 2018 World Leader Award in New York. I should also note she darkened the door of our Bloomberg Global Forum. Thank you so much on behalf of Mike. But finally to say, and seeing the speech a few days ago, in these unusual times, this is not a normal speech. Madame Lagarde.
Thank you very much, Tom. I was reminded of the lady doesn't drift, or was it the lady ain't turning? Thank you very much for your kind introduction. Let me just preface my opening remarks on this last leg of our trip to Indonesia with a recognition of our Indonesian representatives sitting with us. Thank you, Madam Ambassador, for being here with us. Let me express on behalf of the institution, all of us here in this room and all of us working for the IMF, how saddened we are by the latest development that have affected Sulawesi and the passing of so many people, the injuries and the damages that have been caused by the earthquake and the tsunami. We're with you, and I'll announce a few things that we are trying to do to help the people there, because we're all in great sympathy with all of them. So thank you for being with us. Thank you. So as I said, this event is the penultimate leg of our voyage to Indonesia. Oh, there's echo in the room, but it's a male voice. I know they tried to clone me, but not as a man. So, as we all know, it's a challenging moment for Indonesia, a country that has transformed itself in recent decades, unleashing its economic dynamism and harnessing the incredible ingenuity and diversity of its people. A country that is so often dealing with the hardship of natural disaster, as it does at the moment. We can all learn so much from Indonesia and from its ASEAN partners, especially when it comes to building resilience, embracing openness, and reaching across borders. One important lesson that we can learn is that if countries work together, they are far more likely to enhance the well-being of their people than if they go it alone. And we saw this very clearly, not so much in Indonesia, but around the world when the global financial crisis hit. The multilateral spirit is, I think, best captured by this beautiful Indonesian phrase, and I'm amazed at how short you can condense a concept. Gotong royong, working together to achieve a common goal. This spirit is needed more than ever to meet the challenges ahead. Now this morning what I would like to do is talk about 3 of those challenges. One is building a better trade system. 2, guarding against the financial and fiscal turbulence. And 3, rebuilding trust in policymaking and institutions. Before I get to the trade, turbulence, and trust, I would like to present a brief lay of the land on the eve of our annual meetings. First, there's good news. Global growth is still at its highest level since 2011, when economies were rebounding post-crisis. Unemployment is still falling in most countries, and the proportion of the global population living in extreme poverty has dropped to a new record low of less than 10%. In other words, the world continues to experience an expansion that holds the promises of higher income and living standards. So everything is fine. Well, not quite. And only up to a point. For most countries, it has become more difficult to deliver on the promise of greater prosperity because the global economic weather is beginning to change. Now, what do I mean by that? I hope most of you remember that a year ago I said, "The sun is shining, please fix the roof." 6 months ago, I pointed to clouds of risk on the horizon. Well, it is not pouring, but there's a bit of a drizzle. Because today some of the risks have begun to materialize. And indeed, there are signs that growth has plateaued. It is becoming less synchronized, with fewer countries participating in the expansion. In July, we projected 3.9% global growth, both in 2018 and 2019. The outlook has since become a little bit less bright, as you will see from updated forecasts that will be released next week. That is because rhetoric is morphing into a new reality of actual trade barriers. This is not only going to hurt trade, but also, and we are seeing signs of that, investment and manufacturing as uncertainty continues to rise. For now, the United States is growing strongly, supported by a pro-cyclical fiscal expansion and still easy financial conditions, which can become a risk in a maturing business cycle. In other advanced economies, however, there are signs of slowing, especially in the euro area and to some extent in Japan. Turning to emerging Asia, it continues to grow at higher rates than other regions of the world, but we see indicators of moderation in China, which will be exacerbated by trade disputes and will probably impact other countries in the region. Meanwhile, challenges have been mounting in a number of other emerging market and low-income countries, including in Latin America, in the Middle East, and in sub-Saharan Africa. Many of these economies are facing pressures from a stronger US dollar and a tightening of financial market conditions, and some of them are now facing capital outflows. Now, let me be clear. We are not seeing broader financial contagion so far, but we also know that conditions can change rapidly. If the current trade disputes were to escalate further, they could deliver a shock to a broader range of emerging and developing economies. So what should be done? At times like that, we can be reminded of a very nice quote by the American poet Oliver Wendell Holmes, who once said, I quote, "To reach a port, we must sail sometimes with the wind and sometimes against it, but we must sail and not drift, nor lie at anchor." So my key message today is that we need to manage the risks, step up reforms, and modernize the multilateral system. Or to put it in shipping terms, We need to steer the boat and not drift. This means, above all, seizing the opportunity now, while growth remains relatively strong. So my reference to sun is shining, fix the roof now is perfectly compatible with steer the boat, do not drift. How can this be done in practice? Well, by addressing precisely the three challenges that I have mentioned: trade, turbulence, and trust. Let's deal with trade first. Simply put, countries need to work together to build a global trade system that is stronger, fairer, and fit for the future. The stakes are high because the fracturing of global value chains could have a devastating effect on many countries, including the advanced economies. It could also prevent emerging and low-income countries from reaching their full potential. The stakes are high because import restrictions prevent trade from playing its essential role in boosting productivity, spreading new technologies, and reducing poverty. This is why we need to work together to de-escalate and resolve the current trade disputes. History shows that while it is tempting to sail alone, countries must resist the siren call of self-sufficiency. And as Greek legends or history tells us, being guided by siren is not necessarily the best way to get to destination. So going forward, what we need are smarter rules for trade that ensure that all can gain. We need to fix the system. Yes, it is needed. We need to fix the system, but not to destroy it. So the immediate challenge is to strengthen the rules. And this includes looking at the distortionary effects of state subsidies, preventing abuse of dominant positions, and improving the enforcement of intellectual property rights. On these issues, we can be encouraged by the growing number of discussions and proposals that are going on, most recently rising from Canada and the European Union. These are positive steps, and there is further work to be done. For example, if agreement among all countries cannot be achieved, I was a trade minister, you remember, Tom, and trying to have a unanimous agreement of all countries in the WTO is sometimes very difficult. So if there cannot be agreement amongst all countries, governments could use more flexible trade deals where like-minded countries agree to work within the framework of the World Trade Organization. Of course, fixing the system also means that it should be fit for the future. And here again, we could use flexible trade agreements to unlock the full potential of e-commerce and other tradable services such as engineering, communication, and transportation. Many of those services are not properly included under existing WTO rules. Our latest analysis shows that by reducing trading costs for services, where the tariffs are the highest, so reducing it by 15%, we could boost total GDP of the G20 countries by more than 350 billion a year. What is 350 billion a year? It's like adding another South Africa to the G20. These are the kinds of gains that are within reach if we work together, if we focus on creating a better global trade system. And frankly, if you look at what is happening around the world at the moment, there is undoubtedly a clear appetite for trade. The recent African trade agreement and the flurry, including very recently, of bilateral, trilateral negotiations evidence that determination. My second challenge is guarding against fiscal and financial turbulence. And here is the question that you have heard over and over and read about. 10 years after the global financial crisis, Are we better off? Are we safer? And our answer here is yes, but not safe enough yet. We must push on with financial regulatory agenda and its implementation, and we must push against backsliding. And after a decade of relatively easy financial conditions, we have to acknowledge and address the fact that debt levels have reached new highs in advanced, emerging, and low-income countries alike. In fact, global debt, private and public, has reached an all-time high of 182 trillion, almost 60% higher than in 2007. This build-up of debt has left governments and companies more vulnerable to a tightening of the financial conditions. Emerging and developing countries are already feeling the pinch as they adjust to monetary normalization in the advanced world, particularly out of the United States. That process could become even more challenging if it were to accelerate suddenly. It could lead to market corrections, sharp exchange rate movements, and further weakening of capital flows. We estimate that emerging economies, excluding China, could potentially face debt portfolio outflows of up to 100 billion, which would broadly match outflows during the global financial crisis. This should be a wake-up call. We are not there yet, by any means, but we must try to avoid getting there. And we know that some countries are facing rough waters. The IMF is deeply engaged in these economies through analysis and advice and by providing financial assistance when asked and when needed. And we will continue to do so. But for most countries, however, steering the boat means creating more room to act when the next downturn inevitably comes. Emerging economies can create this room by reducing risks from high corporate debt, while greater efforts are needed to make government borrowing more sustainable in low-income countries. In many cases, creating more room means allowing flexible exchange rates to absorb some of the pressures from capital flow reversal. On that point, IMF most recent analysis shows that countries with greater exchange rate flexibility experienced smaller output losses after the global financial crisis. We also found that economies are more resilient when their monetary policy is more trusted and where their independent central bank communicate clearly. Advanced economies need to act as well. They can create the room they need by reducing government deficits and placing public debt on gradual downward path. And this should be done in a fair and growth-friendly way through more efficient spending and by ensuring that the burden of adjustment is shared by all. At the same time, countries should not overlook another aspect of their balance sheets: the public wealth that is tied up in government financial assets, public companies, and natural resources. And here we have new IMF analysis of 31 countries showing total public assets of more than $100 trillion, which is well over twice their GDP. Improving the management of these public assets could deliver additional revenue of about 3% of GDP per year. Now that's a lot. In fact, it's the equivalent of what those countries collect in corporate tax. So they would double their corporate tax receipt by better managing those assets. And again, it's not about sailing alone, with each country responding only to national concerns. Guarding against potential turbulence will require countries working together in a cohesive and collaborative manner. Let me give you an example of that. We know that governments can make their economies less vulnerable to disruptive capital flows by reducing current account imbalance. How? By increasing public investment where fiscal positions are healthy and by lowering fiscal deficits elsewhere. These policy actions that I have just described operate at the national level, but they complement each other at the global level. Now, guarding against financial turbulence also requires a strong financial safety net, which in turn means a well-equipped and well-resourced IMF at its center. This is key to ensure that the fund can play its unique role in helping countries deal with future crises. It's a top priority for us, it's a top priority for me, combined with further adjustment in the governance of the fund to better reflect the changing economic dynamic of our membership. Let me now turn to my third challenge: rebuilding trust in institutions and policy making. There are multiple analyses of the causes for the decline in trust. I would suggest that first and foremost, far too many people remain on the margins. Whether you call it being disenfranchised, disenchanted, feeling the dysfunctionality of the system, but the truth of it is that people, many of them, feel left out. In too many countries, growth has failed to lift the prospects and livelihood of many people. In too many cases, workers and their families are now convinced that the system is somehow rigged, that the odds are stacked against them. And it's not really hard to understand from an economic perspective. Since 1980, the top 1% globally has captured twice as much as the gains from growth as the bottom 50%. 1%, 50%. Twice as much. Over that period, many advanced economies saw rising income inequality and limited growth in wages, not exclusively attributable to trade or international trade or globalization, partly attributable to technology, partly attributable to global integration, yes, and partly due to policies that have favored capital over labor. A related source of dissatisfaction comes from raw memories of the global financial crisis, of which we celebrate the 10th anniversary, because too many people felt that those who caused the crisis did not really face the consequences of it, while they paid a heavy price. A third factor that we see in many countries around the world is corruption, an economic and social plague that makes it hard for countries to take the right collective decisions and which inhibit economic dynamism, which further undermines trust and sets in motion a vicious cycle. And of course, in an age of rapid technological change, of increasing digitalization, of the overwhelming progress of artificial intelligence, we should guard against this risk, yet again, that more people feel left out, not prepared, and yet again not in control of their destiny. There are various estimates of how many jobs may be gained or lost due to technology. There's a finding that I find quite striking from the analytical work that we've done, which is that in OECD countries alone, 26 million of women's jobs, not 26 million of jobs, 26 million of women jobs are likely to disappear, which is more than the number of men's jobs that are likely to disappear. Now, why is that? It's because many of those jobs that women hold are more repetitive and comprise tasks that can be easily replaced and substituted by either robots or the impact of artificial intelligence. Why do I say that? Because I believe that policymakers, governments, should take particular measures in order to prepare the workforce, both men and women, in order to deal with this issue and avoid the human cost of disruption, whether from technology, from trade, or from economic reform. And I believe that governments should actually partner with the private sector as well in order to address those issues. In order to actually invest in people, in health, in education, in social protection systems. These improvements in human, social, and physical capital are especially important in low-income countries, where significant new spending is needed to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. We have recently done some work in order to identify additional spending that is needed, and we have estimated that this additional spending amounts to about 520 billion per year by 2030 for a set of Sustainable Development Goals to be delivered against by 2030, 520 billion per year. Now, we certainly need a 21st century education system to reduce inequality of opportunity and help everyone thrive in the digital age. Education is one of the development goals that we have tried to actually budget for. We need scaled up investment in training and social safety nets so that workers can upgrade their skills, transition for higher quality jobs and earn more. And wherever possible and feasible, we need more progressive taxation and higher minimum wages. And across the globe, we need smarter taxation of multinational corporations to ensure that all pay their fair share in the right place. Fairer policy should also make it easier to balance work and family, where burdens too often falls on women. These policies range from well-designed parental leave to affordable high-quality childcare to tax systems that do not penalize second earners. Another element critical to restoring trust is to implement policies and reforms that not only boost growth, but make it inclusive and sustainable. This means that all countries must join hands to tame the menace, the threat of climate change. If we care about the well-being of future generations, if we care about the plight of climate refugees, we must be serious about pricing carbon emissions to account for their social cost. The IMF is supporting its members on this and many other pressing issues through policy advice, through capacity development, and by providing a platform for sharing best practices and fresh ideas. This is what we are going to do and actually publish in Bali next week on fintech. Together with the World Bank and other partners, we have developed what we called the Bali Fintech Agenda, to be released, as I said, next week. It is a blueprint for all policymakers who are seeking to manage new risks while harnessing fintech potential for the benefit of all, not just a few. This is another example of how we can foster international cooperation that is more inclusive, more open and representative, and more effective in delivering for all people. That's what I have called in other instances, and that I call again, the new multilateralism. And I believe we need it more than ever to address the three challenges of trade, turbulence, and trust. So let me conclude at this point by thanking the executive board of the IMF. Many members are here this morning. Our unbelievably talented and diverse staff, many of them are here this morning, because they embody the highest aspirations of international cooperation, of this new multilateralism that I have just mentioned. And that can be beautifully captured in Indonesian language, which yet again brings things together. Bhinneka Tunggal Ika. Unity in diversity and stronger together. So when we sail together, we are stronger, nimbler, better able to steer the ship through rough waters, avoid the rocks of shipwreck. And even though it drizzles a bit, despite the fact that we're on a boat, it is time to fix the roof. And I haven't seen much by way of fixing in the last 6 months. So now as we set sail on our voyage to Indonesia, I hope we can work together so that we can steer our economies in the right direction and bring all people, whether on big or small boats, to this new port. Thank you very much.
Well, so much to talk about here, and with a wonderful audience, so many familiar faces again on different themes, on international relations, on debt, and on trade turbulence and trust. Completely separate from that is what you are known for 7 years on the watch here and for the years I've known you, which is where some talk and others do. I know no one who has moved forward this delicate, obvious debate of gender and diversity as you have consistently executed on a daily basis. And all in economics share the excitement of your new appointment for chief economist or director of economic research here at the International Monetary Fund. McKinnon, my assistant, turned to me and said, we've interviewed Gopinath. She's really good. Okay, there's the analysis from the media. Tell us how you came to this decision to choose the PhD from Princeton. You had nothing to do with it, right?
I had a lot to do with it. So did all my colleagues. And I think that she passed all the tests, all the hurdles, all the many interviews and the review of her credentials with flying colors. She's a class act. She happens to be a woman. And we are delighted that she's joining the IMF. Geeta Gopinath is a class act. And she will steal the show from me. That's good. She'll come and rescue me.
Oh, well, okay, we'll see about that. Her PhD was with Rogoff and Bernanke, among others. Did you speak to Rogoff and Bernanke about this choice?
I did speak with quite a few economists to have their feedback, their input, their intelligence about her, the way she leads, the way she works, the way she operates with teams, and I was totally confident that this is just the best decision. Yes.
Let us turn to Indonesia. It is 609 miles from Bali up to Palu. The IMF, back to 1962, has a method of helping poor countries stabilize during these processes. Indonesia is not a poor country in need of IMF services, and yet the IMF wants to contribute.
Well, you're right, Tom. We have rapid financing facilities that can be mobilized very quickly when a country is facing such hardship, but that's not the case, and certainly has not been requested by Indonesia, which has the budgetary means to deal with the current very saddening developments that are affecting Palu in particular. But we are also a community of individuals who have feelings and who want to help. So what we did for Lombok, which was hurt 2 months ago, we had a collective fundraising exercise, and I'll be very, very proud to deliver a big check to the Red Cross in Lombok next week. We are now starting a new exercise of fundraising for the people of Palu and other communities who are affected by the earthquake and the tsunami. So everybody from staff and from the executive board who contributes will be matched 100% by the IMF itself. And I hope that we can also participate, just us as a community.
Very good.
And whether Indonesia asks for it or not, we will bring the check, yes.
That's good. I see a clock here. Can you move this back to 60 minutes right now? Okay, let's dive into this. There's so much to talk about, including, of course, trade and the announcement from the president in Canada last night. Within all of this, let us begin with your theme of Holmes, Wendell Holmes, in steering and outdrift. You have to have courage to go into the wind. In sailing, come about hard to lee or something breaks or whatever, it takes a courage to steer, not drift. What is the courage required now from the IMF and from your major parties?
I think it takes the courage to look beyond the immediate short-term numbers and situation. Because if you just look at the short term, you think to yourself, okay, growth is not so bad, unemployment is going down, it's good. So we don't need to take any more structural reforms. We can continue to spend, there's growth. I think the courage is to actually be honest about what comes next and what are the risks beyond that immediate short term. And it takes the second courage to actually explain that to the populations, to not go the easy way, which would consist of not being honest about what's coming.
You had one paragraph, which, and I could be humorous about this and say borders on supply side economics, but the idea, the zeitgeist that's out there that we can grow our way out of private and public debt. Your number of 182 trillion, I think of Kotlikoff at Boston University, who's been so good at trying to sum up all this debt, as your experts do as well. And yet there's a belief out there, I'll suggest led by the Trump administration, but others, that we can grow our way out of our troubles. You don't ascribe to that, do you?
No. We just cannot blindly continue to borrow without restraint, reservations, or good policies. We just have to control our fiscal position in our respective countries, for those who are policymakers, and we have to put debt on a declining path. It doesn't have to be brutal, but it certainly has to be put on a declining path. And that is certainly the case for many sovereigns. It is definitely the case for corporates, because where we have seen a very sizable growing debt is on the part of corporates. And I think that at that level too, caution needs to be applied.
It's a dire straits economy, money for nothing. Rates have been low, nominal and real rates. Your Maroon book, your fiscal book with Cottarelli and others over the years has been brilliant at explaining the enticement of low interest rates. And yet now we're beginning to see this come up here.
Correct.
What will that be in your books here as you go to this meeting, the World Economic Outlook and others?
Yes, absolutely. The Fiscal Monitor, which will be published, all three, the World Economic Outlook, the Fiscal Monitor, and the GFSR, all of them will be looking at the volume of debt. The Fiscal Monitor does an interesting analysis on a balance sheet basis, looking at not only the assets but the liabilities, and drawing some interesting conclusions on that front. But clearly, as the situation improves, which it has now, from an economic growth point of view, as inflation is picking up, as unemployment is coming down, you clearly have tightening of monetary policy in the air, which will clearly have a cost for these debts that have built up both at sovereign level and at private company levels. When you look at the maturity cycles, and clearly there will be refinancing needed, which will come at a higher price. So that obviously will have an impact on those sovereigns and those corporates.
Let us touch on trade now within the 20 minutes that we have left. I look at trade, I look at all these debates, and it's remarkable to me how many discussions are uninformed about the price theory, the microeconomics, the complex dynamics of the processes of trade as well. The words are, the press conferences are in simplicity, oftentimes simply wrong theory as well. What can you do and your PhDs do to get us towards a new multilateralism, or if I dare invent something for you as you go to Indonesia, even a new bilateralism? What do we need to do to get the debate on trade back on track?
I think we need to focus on the benefits that trade has provided over the course of the last 30 years. You only need to look at, and I think we do that in the analytical work that we produce, how it has improved productivity, how it has fueled innovation, how it has reduced the prices of so many goods that people use, and more so the low-income households than the high-income households. So those are benefits that we cannot just take for granted. They are there. They've reduced prices, they've improved productivity, and they've improved innovation and facilitated the organization of supply chains that have allowed for the trickling of innovations throughout the chain. Now, what we also have to acknowledge, by the same token, is that not everybody has had the benefit of trade, and certain sectors, certain regions have suffered as a result of the organization of supply chains, the dislocation of manufacturing from particular sectors and particular countries to other countries and other regions. And policymakers have to account for that and have to plan for support, safety nets that is granted to those people. But you know, we cannot, it's not, there's no trade-off about trade, actually. There is a net plus that needs to be partially redirected to those people who are suffering as a result of trade, notably, but not only, because I think there is also oversimplification in identifying losses of jobs, for instance, to global trade. No, it's not just global trade. It's also vastly about technology impact on jobs. It's also about the fact that, you know, the tax regime applicable to capital is far more supportive than that applied to labor. So what do you do as an investor? You know, beef up your capital expenditures and you reduce your labor.
In America, we would say we beat them up abroad, and that's a whole domestic debate as well. I had the privilege of speaking today to your Abe Selassie in your African department. And the risk here that I see within the United States, a domestic dialogue, or within Europe, a domestic dialogue, is that the new non-multilateralism, the new unilateralism, or the word that I use on air, the Trump lateral approach, my way or the highway, puts frontier economies in more fragile emerging markets flat on their back. How close are we to that, where a blind unilateral rhetoric really damages some of these fragile economies?
Well, first of all, I don't think that we have begun seeing the impact of those threats and now proposed measures in the numbers. So if you look at trade numbers, they're still reasonably
The tariff debate,
good.
we haven't seen the numbers yet.
Yeah, we haven't seen the direct impact on trade. But we're beginning to see the impact that uncertainty leading to lack of confidence have on investment and manufacturing. We're seeing that pretty much in all emerging market economies, including China, but also in many advanced economies, excluding the United States. So the impact is there already. And if you think of, you know, the impact that all the measures that have been floating around would have on global growth, then you're really talking about a major risk that would impact particularly China, because it's obviously one of the targets and the main targets, but also all the other countries that are part of the supply chain or that provide raw materials. So you're talking about emerging market economies and many low-income countries as well, where a lot of the hardship and the difficult decisions and the financing is so badly needed. You know, how can we advocate domestic revenue mobilization in countries of sub-Saharan Africa if they can no longer participate in trade or supply chain organizations because of the threat applying to trade at large?
The larger threat, and to bring it to this weekend in Canada and the United States, the USMCA, I've had to write it down here, it's such a new phrase for me, and I understand
Think of YMCA. It's USMCA.
It's a song. I got it. Okay. Within this and within USMCA, now I've got the song in my head. I can't continue. But, no, I'm not going to dance it. That wouldn't work out. Anyhow, I would take. If I look at USMCA and I look at the dictate of what President Trump has very clearly advocated, it is an effort that brings in Canada, brings in Mexico. And I don't want to get you in trouble here, but I'm going to ask, did Canada and Mexico cave into the rhetoric of President Trump? And is that something we're going to see in the coming years as a president looks at multilateral and brings it over to a unilateral approach?
You know, it's hard for me to say and to make any comment about the agreement because we haven't had a chance to review it. So I've read the same articles as you have. But it's been in the making for 13 months. So it's obvious that there must have been back and forth, bargaining, trade-off, and it's the whole point about negotiations. Two things that I'm quite pleased about. One is it exists. And to have this trilateral agreement between Mexico, US, and Canada is, I think, a very positive signal. I'm encouraged with that. Because not so long ago, many of us were in fear that there would be nothing. So there is an agreement, number one. Number two, what I hear is that the services are also partly or entirely, I don't know, I haven't read it yet, covered. And I think that is really showing the way that TPP, for instance, was doing. In other words, expanding beyond the products that cross borders to services that also do, but not physically because many of them are digital. There is a lot of upside to be had from services being included in the reduction of barriers. As I mentioned, we have done a study. You can actually significantly increase equivalent of the corporate tax collected by the 31 countries that we've studied if barriers on services were down by 15%. It's not bad.
I want to come back to China in a minute, but always a pleasure, as I did a few days ago, to speak with Barry Eichengreen of the University of California.
He's a good friend of
at Berkeley. And the gentleman, I kid him that he puts out a book that's a short monograph, and then he really dives into something and does an Eichengreen tour de force. And we have that now with The Populism Temptation. If you're looking for something to read, this is the book, The Populism Temptation. And within that is this drift to political populism, some of which you've seen in your France, but also the fears of an authoritarian structure, almost a neo-fascist structure, that in Europe, but frankly worldwide as well. How do you synthesize this new populism that Professor Eichengreen speaks of, and what do we do about it?
You know, I have to look at it from, in my position, from an economic perspective. And I think that the growth that will hopefully continue to develop will be, as I said, inclusive and sustainable, so that economic actors, people in their job, in their consumption, in their investment, feel that they are included, that they are in charge, they are in control of their economic destiny. If there is a strong feeling that it all goes to the same category and it leaves to the side of the road of development them, then it's hardly surprising that people are disenchanted and are likely to listen to the sirens of populism.
You mentioned inequality wonderfully in one of the paragraphs of your discussion here. I don't have it in front of me right now, but the idea of a persistent inequality in what some would say is a gilded age. What is your reading of history in terms of how we extricate ourselves from any given gilded age? Is it the ballot box?
I think, you know, coming from a country that strongly believes in democracy, in freedom, and in the strength of markets with appropriate regulations to guard against abuses, yes, of course, ballot box is one, but policy measures are also necessary as well. You know, if I take this issue of international taxation, it's an important task to actually identify where is the tax base, where it is taxed, where there is evasion, and where it should be remedied. And the same goes for corruption. When you look at, you know, the money laundering that happens, when you look at the corruption that is facilitated by all that,
right,
it needs to be tackled head-on and addressed so that people actually feel that it's not just for others, including
right,
those who fiddle with the system, but it's for everybody.
In the time that we have left, Managing Director, I want to come back to two housekeeping ideas and then also finish up with the South China Sea. The first one is, I believe there's an understanding that the dominant party has their headquarters, the IMF headquarters, where they are, and that would be the United States right now. But is it possible that over the years, if China becomes that dominant, that Amazon's looking for a new headquarters, are you going to shift your headquarters to Beijing? Or indeed, I say, migrate it somehow to Paris?
Ooh, Paris would be tempting. But you can see the family more often. Well, first of all, I hope that Amazon comes to Washington. It'd be great, wouldn't it?
Well, it would be. And I would point out, if I can do an ad for Bloomberg, Mr. Rubenstein with a really penetrating discussion with Jeff Bezos, and I believe scheduled as a discussion, David Rubenstein talking to you as well. We'll see that at some point.
That is correct.
We'll see that.
I'm not sure it will be
before
as fascinating.
2021 or 23. We'll get it out there.
That's right.
At some point.
But I think it's unlikely that the headquarters of the IMF will move outside of Washington in the near future, because I think the articles provide that we have to be in the country which has the largest representation at the IMF. This is still the United States, and I think for a while to go.
A bit of laughter leads to the most sensitive topic I see each and every discussion of the International Monetary Fund, which is simply power. The mug, I love this mug. Can I take this home?
Yes, please.
And with the beautiful flags as well. You know what? There's got to be a quota shift at some point. And you've been eloquent about this. I think for everybody in the room, it's widely understood. But for our audience worldwide, someday, somehow, there has to be a shift from the old guard of, picking, you and I watched The Crown together from George VI, and before that Queen Mary. We got to go over somewhere to Asia, the voyage to China, maybe it would be called. Not when does this happen, but how do you envision that shift in power within this organization occurring?
Well, the beauty of this organization, the IMF, is that it is actually embedded in the articles of the institution, that the formula which allocates the quota is a bit like the capital of a company. So the formula that allocates it amongst the shareholders has to evolve over the course of time. So when countries gain in strength, size of the economy, and so on and so forth, they have to have a larger share in the institution. It is happening very gradually, too gradually, but at the moment, in my top 10 shareholders, I have all the emerging market economies. So that's a progress compared with the previous state of affairs, and we have to re-examine that situation, adapt it yet again, and I would be very surprised if a country like China or India, for instance, did not have a higher share in the IMF than they do at the moment. That is most likely to happen, and the founding fathers of the IMF, there were no mothers in those days, had decided so.
Within the 8 minutes that we have left, I want to return to the South China Sea and then south to Indonesia as well. One of my books of the summer was Robert Kaplan's The Return of Marco Polo's World, which is a set of essays about the shift that we see within the region, within your voyage to Indonesia as well. The South China Sea seems to be almost a crucible. You've traveled the entire circle of it as well. What is the best outcome you see that economically advantages those many countries within the politics and with the projection of China as well?
Definitely a new multilateral order, and one where you do not have a bilateral order which would be headed by China on the one hand and the United States on the other, because that creates those, fiefdom and dependency relationships between members of the supply chain, if you will, in each region. And the ability to reach out and to develop a truly multilateral world is actually the best way to guard against the prevalence or the dominance of one, two particular members.
Within that, then, is what I see interview to interview to be the hypersensitive question, and I ask this of you with great respect for the pressures you're under, which is within, as you mentioned, China and America. Do you perceive this moment in America to be a one-off event and we return post-Trump, one term, two terms, back to some normalcy? Or is there a shift in America which makes for a shift across the Pacific as well?
My childhood or my teen years were guided by writers like Alexis de Tocqueville, who wrote beautiful essays on the United States of America, De la démocratie en Amérique. And I, for myself, strongly hope and I believe that there are values that are so strongly embedded in the American people's psyche, their sense of freedom, their aspiration to individual accomplishment within a nation, within a community, their hospitality to others, and their tolerance, which I hope will continue to be celebrated in many generations. I hope never to be disappointed by my American friends.
Within that is
Never.
the liberalism of the moment and rekindling that liberalism. You see it in your three research pieces that you'll publish at Bali. You see it in the day-to-day activities of the IMF. That liberalism that many would suggest is under threat right now always gets solved at the ballot box. And I don't mean the midterm elections as much as I mean the next presidential election and forward. And yet it's not just about America. That liberalism is affected everywhere. Within Italy, we see it. Within the dynamics of France, as Macron came in, and of course recently in Germany and Eastern Europe as well. How do we maintain that liberalism while we wait for these populism experiments to play out?
I think what is really needed is to try to analyze what is actually causing these developments. And I'm not sure that the diagnosis is the same all over the world. I think that the rising inequality can be a predominant cause in some countries. I think the fear of the refugees and the foreigners and the sense that where is my system going and is it being taken over can be another cause somewhere else. And I think that the responsibility of the leaders with courage should be to actually identify those causes and deal with them. And when I see, some of the European leaders actually trying to put in place mechanisms to both welcome the refugees, but also protect the borders and give a sense to member countries and to the people in those member countries that they live in a protected environment as well. I think this is perfectly, number one, compatible. Number two, aimed at addressing the fears that in turn fuel the risk of populism.
You have foreign meetings in Bali and I believe then to Marrakesh in a number of years, I believe is correct. Part of this, and Kaplan again captures this more of Malaysia than Indonesia, is the clashing of religions and cultures that we see. Speak of Indonesia, speak of the west to east sprawl that we've seen develop over the many, many decades into what I think for so many of our viewers and listeners is a misunderstanding of the fourth most populous country in the world, the distance for so many in the West. Identify why you're going to Bali, why you're going to Indonesia.
Well, as you said, it is the fourth most populous country in the world.
In the youth, the youngness of it.
And the contribution of young people is just phenomenal. Second, it's a fast-growing economy, north of 5%. It is one that in the last 20 years has very strongly restructured its banking system, has improved its fiscal policies, has taken some very, very courageous measures to remove unnecessary subsidies in order to redirect those subsidies toward infrastructure and education. So I think it's a strong signal on the part of the IMF board, and it's been decided not by me, but by the board of the IMF representing 189 countries, that Indonesia is the right destination because it is Asia's turn anyway, and because that country has actually put in place the support facilities and has the urge to welcome the world in order to showcase the economic development and the reforms that have been put in place. Added to which, the people of Indonesia are so hospitable, so generous, so nice, including in hard times, that it's difficult to resist. And they're taking all the measures necessary to make sure that the meetings will take place in safe and sound conditions.
Why don't we leave it there? Thank you so much.
Thank you.